You can call me Bob. One of the more annoying questions that is often asked of an artist is, when did you first know that you wanted to be an artist? It was 1967. I was in the 7th grade, and it was a particularly rainy night in the middle of the winter. I remember this because it was getting dark early, and my father wasn't home yet. He was a banker. He was a manager of a branch of Wells Fargo Bank. And that particular day, earlier in the day, he had heard that his grandfather, my great-grandfather, had passed away. Now, my father's mother had abandoned him, so he was raised by his grandparents, and this particular person was quite close to him. And so my father left the bank about 10 a.m. and went across the street and started drinking. So by 7 o'clock at night, he was thoroughly hammered. And while driving, he also had a particular penchant for an American-made automobile, which he always drove. It was a rear-engine Corvair Monza. It was made by General Motors, and it had the distinction of being the car that Ralph Nader made famous in his first novel, or his first book about safety, and it is titled Unsafe at Any Speed, about the rear-engine Corvair Monza. My father was traveling home, schnockered, and he was on a particularly windy street that was elevated, and the two lanes heading north were elevated 6 feet above the other two lanes coming the opposite direction. And he must have been traveling at a rather high rate of speed, because his car left the lane and traveled over the other two lanes of traffic going the other way. And there was a 6-foot fence here, and he cleared the 6-foot fence. So he didn't even knock the fence down. And it was a hillside that dropped down from there, and it was in the backyard of a suburban tract of homes, where his car lost forward momentum and fell flat like a pancake into an above-ground swimming pool that was filled with water in the backyard of this house. And the car was still running. It's a air-cooled engine, and it was bubbling away, and he tried to get out, and he couldn't get out because the door wouldn't open. It was confined. And he rolled the window down because the car was filling up with water, and he crawled out, and he got outside the pool onto the deck. And by now there were a half a dozen onlookers looking over the fence, and he yelled up to him, "How deep is the water here?" And somebody said, "It's 3 feet." So he got back in, reached over, and turned off the car and put his keys in his pocket. Now, my father wore a 3-piece suit when he was at the bank, so he had to climb up the hillside. Now remember, it's pouring, just cats and dogs. It's just dumping, one of the most torrential rainstorms of the season. He crawls up through the mud, climbs over the fence, and by now there's about 40 people there, and the first police officer shows up. Police officer gets out of his car and he goes, "Ed, looks like you need a cab. Let me call one for you." And he called a cab, and the cab came, picked up my dad, brought him home. Now, I was at home. It was just after supper time. Of course, my mother was quite upset that he hadn't arrived yet, and it was late for him. And so when he arrived, he got out of the cab, and he was absolutely soaking wet. Of course, he was piss drunk, so he immediately went in and to change his clothes and take a shower. And my brother and I were sent downstairs not to return for the rest of the evening. We didn't know really what had happened, but it was the next day, because this happened on a Wednesday. And on Thursday, I was sitting in my 7th grade art class, and I remember distinctly there were 4 tables butted up against each other, and 2 students were facing me, and the person next to me, we were facing each other like foursquare. And we were working on a dry pastel. It was an abstraction, and I remember quite clearly that my piece was in red violets, the tones of red violets, and we were rubbing our hands in it and blending the pastels. And the person across from me was Rick Karmer. And Rick Karmer, I knew, he lived in the vicinity of Jefferson Avenue and an apartment building. And he started to tell this story of what he had seen that day. You will not believe what I saw. This guy in a car flew over, it landed in a swimming pool, he climbed up the top of the pool, climbed over the fence, and that was my dad. So that was the moment when I realized what actually had happened, but it solidified my desire to make art the rest of my life because of that pastel drawing and that particular story.